the Battle of Baltimore.
Hi, my name is Ryan Forrest. We are doing a group documentary on the Battle of Baltimore.
Hi, I'm Gianni Vito.
Hi, I'm Justin Gardner.
Hello, my name is Connor Icard.
The British Army attacked Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1814 and burned the capital down before withdrawing their ships to the Chesapeake Bay. The British Army next planned to attack Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland. The British were unaware that Baltimore knew about the upcoming attack and that the Americans were preparing for war. The British began with a small land attack by using about 4,000 soldiers. When the British arrived in Baltimore, several hundred Americans opened fire on the British officers. The Americans had the upper hand by having the high ground. The British saw this American advantage and immediately sent a message to the warships to attack the fort with guns and mortars. But the only problem was that the ships had already been firing at the fort since the early morning. The British guns were more powerful than those of the forts. The British Army had the advantage of being able to rain bombs at the forts while the American guns could not even reach the British. But few Americans were killed because most mortars either missed or failed to explode. During the war, the British kept an American doctor and a lawyer, better known as Francis Scott Key, hostage, and did not permit either of them to return to land until the attack was over. The attack continued through the entire rainy day. The British tried many different land attacks, but the Americans were able to retaliate and fire back. These attacks resulted in failures for the British. The British admiral finally ordered the soldiers to retreat to their ships. The British stopped firing mortars at about 7 in the morning. The British retreated all of their soldiers back into the Chesapeake Bay, which resulted in an American victory.
Francis Scott Key was born in Frederick, Maryland, in the year 1779. He grew up and became a lawyer. During the early 1800s, around 1810, the American colonies had issues with Great Britain because they were blocking trade with France and kidnapping American seamen. One of the Francis Scott Key's peers, Dr. William Beans, was captured by the British. Key went on the British ships to negotiate the release of not only his friend, but other captured Americans as well. During this time, the British had already planned an attack on Fort McHenry and would not let any Americans off the ships at this time. So, Francis Scott Key and many others were trapped on the British ships. During September 13th, the British were constantly bombing the fort, and until the next morning, they were seemingly unsuccessful. The next morning, Francis Scott Key watched as the American flag was raised at the fort. This left a feeling of success in the hearts of these American men. While Key was trapped on the British ships, he noted down some words to a poem that he was writing. Once he was let off the British ships with his American friends, he went to rest where he finished this poem. In this poem, he recorded what he witnessed during the battle, what he had heard, and then later, this poem was set to an old drinking song named To Anacreon in Heaven, and the song was later called the Star-Spangled Banner. In the year 1931, President Herbert Hoover declared the Star-Spangled Banner the national anthem of the United States of America.
Fort McHenry was a major battleground in the Battle of Baltimore. This was where the Americans held up against a heavy British attack. The battle took place on the 13th and 14th of September in 1814. The American colonists were very angry because Great Britain was putting major trade restrictions on them. They were also taxing everything that the colonists were doing so they could bring back more money to Great Britain. This ended up starting a war between the Americans and Great Britain, so Great Britain attacked. The Americans caused major setbacks for the British, such as high numbers of casualties. In this attack, the goal of the British was to take control of Baltimore, but they failed. Baltimore was one of the largest cities in the United States at the time, so the British thought if they could take over this land, they would be in better position to win the war. the British attacked through Chesapeake Bay by using their navy. The Americans held strong against the British and came out with the victory. The battle at Fort McHenry was a must-win for the Americans, and they did what they needed to do. If the Americans never won the battle at Fort McHenry, who knows what life would be like today.
The War of 1812 was a war taking place between the British and the Americans that was initiated by the Americans because they wanted freedom and to be able to live without the British controlling and taxing them. The Battle of Baltimore was a part of the War of 1812, first beginning in North Point, where the Americans had a strategic victory, but the British had a tactical victory. Overall, in the Battle of North Point, the American troops won because they killed British General Ross and slowed down the British's advancement. The battle continued at Fort McHenry and eventually ended there as well. This was a turning point for the whole war. Very soon after this, the British and American representatives signed a treaty of peace and amity at Ghent, Belgium. This was the overall compromise of the war as a whole, and the Battle of Baltimore was a major battle that influenced the outcome of the war. Without the Battle of Baltimore and the outcome of it, we may be in a very different situation than we are in today.
When the United States declared war on Great Britain in 1812, naval warfare was vital in the Battle of Baltimore. The British Navy, or better known as the Royal Navy, were far superior compared to the American Navy because of their experience. The British had a strong fleet of ships that operated for centuries, rather than the American ships, who were fairly new at only 18 years old. The British had about 140,000 seamen, 31,000 of whom were well-trained Marines. The U.S. Navy only having about 5,000 seamen and 1,000 Marines. The Royal Navy ships were undermanned and had very harsh conditions, including terrible punishments and rough company. But the British were highly armed with strong artillery on board the ships. In the Battle of Baltimore, the ships were stationed to fire mortars and rain bombs on Fort McHenry. Even though his ships were very inaccurate, they played a very strong role in naval wars. The Americans were able to beat the odds against a strong Royal Navy and take the victory at Fort McHenry.
The Star-Spangled Banner, which was written by Francis Scott Key, was a poem that noted what he witnessed during this battle, that he was trapped on British ships to negotiate a deal with them. While aboard these British ships, he recorded what he saw and wrote it down in a poem, and it was later named the Star-Spangled Banner. The Star-Spangled Banner later on became the national anthem of the United States of America. In this poem that became a song, in the first verse we hear the following: "Oh, say, can you see, by the dawn's early light," which also simply means that this was a huge American flag that waved, was seen during the day and late into the night of the battle, but also in the following early morning, the flag was also seen. Was so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, or also the Americans hung this flag at the night time into very, very late, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, or meaning during another battle during the War of 1812, or the perilous fight, the flag was still waved with pride. Or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Or, in other words, the fort proudly still standing as the bombs from the British and from the fort went off, and they were so grateful as this flag kept waving. For the last part, "Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave," also means the flag with all the stars on it that waved symbolized the land for those who had fought for it, and now it was free for everyone.